The lake shimmered under the evening sun, calm and still, as if it remembered the years of hard work it took to exist. It wasn't just a patch of water surrounded by trees, it was a piece of my soul. I bought this land 15 years ago when it was nothing but dry dirt and tangled brush. Every rock, every trail, every ripple in the water carried a story of sweat and patience. I built the ranch from the ground up, the barn, the cabins, the fences. And when the reservoir expanded naturally over time, I turned it into a small private lake. It became my place of peace, a sanctuary away from the noise of the badge I wore every day. Being the county sheriff came with its weight, constant calls, people's problems, the endless cycle of law and disorder. Out here, under the stars, I could finally breathe. That weekend, I decided to take my camper down by the lake, just a few hundred yards off the main road. I set up my tent, lit a small campfire, and let the sound of crickets blend with the crackle of the wood. It was my land, privately owned, registered, and fenced, but part of it bordered a newly developed neighborhood governed by an HOA that didn't exist when I first settled here. At first, they seemed harmless. But as the neighborhood expanded, the HOA began pushing further, questioning property lines, complaining about livestock noise, and sending letters about aesthetic disruptions. They didn't like that my old barn could be seen from their walking trail. Apparently, my working ranch wasn't community-friendly. That evening, as I sipped coffee by the fire, I noticed headlights slowing near the ridge road. A white SUV lingered longer than it should have. I didn't think much of it, probably a curious neighbor. But minutes later, I heard voices from across the water, faint but unmistakable. They weren't the kind of voices that admired the sunset. They were sharp, accusing, filled with that unmistakable tone of self-righteous entitlement. Someone shouted something about unauthorized camping. Another mentioned community safety. I couldn't help but smirk. Unauthorized camping? On my own land? The irony was almost poetic. But when I saw the phone light flicker and heard one of them say, "I'm calling the cops," that's when I knew where this was headed. The HOA had finally decided to draw their line, right through my property. I didn't move. I didn't argue. I just watched the stars appear one by one above the lake, calm as ever, while somewhere in town, dispatch was receiving a call about a suspicious camper at the edge of the lake. I knew exactly who would be getting that call in a few minutes. And when that radio crackled to life, I couldn't help but smile. Because I was the sheriff. And the night was about to get interesting. The night air hung thick with tension and irony. Somewhere across the county, a group of self-important HOA members had just reported a trespasser on private land, my land. And sitting by the campfire, listening to the crackle of burning wood, I couldn't help but think how poetic it all was. The radio in my truck came alive, echoing through the quiet. Dispatch's voice carried that familiar professional calm, unaware of the absurdity unfolding. A suspicious male was allegedly camping near the lake on the edge of Ridgewood Estates, possibly intoxicated, possibly homeless, possibly dangerous. My deputies were being sent to investigate. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the fire, amused by the sheer audacity. The same HOA that had sent letters complaining about my horses, that demanded I repaint my barn to match the community aesthetic, now had the nerve to report me for unauthorized use of property. They'd been trying for months to pressure me into selling part of my land to expand their lakeside access. I'd always declined, politely, firmly, and legally. Apparently, they thought intimidation might change my mind. The sound of tires crunching gravel cut through the night. 2 sheriff vehicles rolled down the dirt road, headlights washing over the field like searchlights. The deputies stepped out, cautious but confused. They knew my truck, my tent, and my face. They'd seen them all 100 times. The younger deputy looked almost embarrassed as he approached, holding the report in his hand. I didn't need words to understand what was happening, the HOA must have given them quite the story. To their credit, my deputies were professional. They checked IDs, confirmed property records, and called in to verify ownership. And within minutes, the truth unfolded over the radio: the trespasser was the landowner, and the county sheriff. I could almost imagine the look on the HOA president's face when dispatch relayed that detail back to her. As my deputies apologized for the inconvenience, I told them not to worry. They were just doing their jobs. The real issue wasn't them, it was the people who thought rules applied selectively, depending on who held the clipboard and who held the land deed. A few minutes later, the HOA's self-appointed security committee arrived. Flashlights, clipboards, and that unmistakable air of suburban authority. They didn't know who I was yet. They approached cautiously, whispering about liability and safety concerns. I let them finish their little performance. They talked about community guidelines, about how camping near shared water access wasn't allowed, and how the board would need to review my activity. It was painfully clear they believed the lake was theirs. That's when one of the deputies finally spoke up. Calm, steady, but with a hint of humor. He told them exactly who I was. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Their flashlights wavered. Their expressions shifted from authority to disbelief, then to something closer to embarrassment. The so-called trespasser they tried to evict wasn't just the landowner. He was the man in charge of every officer within a 50-mile radius. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth was its own kind of justice. As they stammered excuses about confusion and misunderstanding, I simply nodded and told them to have a good night. But as they left, one of them muttered something under her breath about reviewing the property boundary. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over. They'd made a mistake, and rather than admit it, they'd double down. The next morning, the lake was still. Mist hovered above the water like a veil, untouched by the chaos of the night before. But I knew peace wouldn't last. The HOA had tasted humiliation, and people like that rarely swallow it quietly. They'd been exposed, embarrassed in front of law enforcement, and worst of all, they'd been proven wrong. By sunrise, I'd already received an email from their Community Compliance Board. It was filled with formal language and veiled hostility, citations about environmental concerns, public nuisance, and unapproved structures near shared resources. It ended with a polite but poisonous note: further noncompliance may result in legal escalation. It was astonishing, their ability to twist the narrative, to make the innocent look like the problem. I owned this land, had the deeds to prove it, had even paid for a full property survey when the HOA first expanded their development. But logic and documentation meant nothing to those driven by pride. By noon, a group of HOA members stood along the property fence, clipboards in hand, pointing, measuring, pretending to inspect the area. They were trying to intimidate me, to make me feel watched, pressured. The irony was, I dealt with hardened criminals on a weekly basis. This, to me, was theater. But theater can turn dangerous when pride is involved. A few days later, I got another visit, this time from a county code enforcement officer. Someone had filed a complaint about illegal land use and environmental damage. They accused me of diverting water into a private lake without authorization. The officer was polite, professional, and uncomfortable. He'd seen this play before, rich homeowners weaponizing bureaucracy to target whoever didn't fit their picture-perfect neighborhood. I showed him every permit, every water management document, every official signature. Within minutes, it was clear I'd done nothing wrong. The report would be closed. But the damage wasn't meant to be legal, it was social. The HOA wasn't trying to win in court, they were trying to wear me down. They started spreading rumors in the community Facebook group, that I was an unstable loner, that I was abusing power, that the lake was somehow unsafe. Some even hinted that I'd threatened HOA members that night by intimidating them with authority. It was a narrative designed to turn neighbors against me. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't their neighbor. I was their jurisdiction. And they were now interfering in something far larger than a lakefront argument. The final straw came when I returned home one evening to find an official-looking sign posted near the lake, "Private HOA access point, trespassing prohibited." They'd claimed part of my property as theirs. Without permission. Without legal right. That wasn't just arrogance anymore, it was trespassing, fraud, and harassment rolled into one. I stood there in silence, reading the sign, listening to the wind brush through the trees. A storm was building, not in the sky, but in the paperwork, the calls, and the actions that would follow. They'd made their move. Now, it was time for me to make mine. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my patience had reached its end. For weeks, I had let the HOA play their little games, the complaints, the false reports, the boundary disputes. I'd watched them twist the truth, mock the law, and weaponize rules they didn't even understand. But this sign they'd posted, that was the final straw. They'd crossed from annoyance into criminal territory. As sheriff, I had authority. As the landowner, I had rights. And now, it was time to remind them of both. I started with paperwork, the one thing HOA boards claimed to respect above all else. I filed an official trespass report, complete with photographs of the illegal sign, GPS coordinates, and survey data proving that the area they claimed was well within my boundary. Then I contacted the county property division to request an immediate review. Within hours, they confirmed it, the HOA had installed their sign on private land. Next, I contacted the district attorney's office. The charge? Unlawful posting of signage, harassment, and potential property encroachment. The HOA president, a woman who had built her reputation on micromanaging lawns and mailbox paint colors, was about to receive a very different kind of letter. One with a county seal and a signature that read, "Sheriff." But I didn't stop there. I knew their game wasn't just legal, it was social. They thrived on public opinion, using community gossip as a weapon. So I turned their tactic against them. I organized a community meeting. Officially, it was about land use and rural property rights. Unofficially, it was to set the record straight. Dozens of residents showed up, curious, defensive, some even angry. The HOA board sat near the front, whispering to each other, visibly tense. When I stood up and presented every document, the deeds, the maps, the permits, the room fell silent. Every accusation they had thrown at me unraveled under the weight of proof. Then, calmly, I explained how they had filed false complaints, wasted county resources, and illegally tampered with private property. People began to murmur. Some faces turned red. Others looked away in shame. The myth of the rogue camper was dead. Within days, the sign was removed. The HOA president issued a carefully worded apology, blaming a miscommunication between committees. But I knew better. Their arrogance had met a boundary they couldn't cross, the law itself. Still, I didn't hold a grudge. I wasn't interested in revenge, only in peace, the same peace I'd sought the night I first camped by the lake. So a week later, I returned there once again. Same spot. Same fire. The water was calm, reflecting the stars like nothing had ever disturbed it. Sometimes, justice doesn't roar, it settles quietly, like ripples fading on a lake's surface. The HOA had learned that power without humility is just noise. And as sheriff, I'd learned that silence, steady, lawful silence, is often the loudest victory of all. When the flames danced in the wind and the crickets sang once more, I leaned back in my chair, smiling at the stillness I'd earned. The lake was mine again. Peace had returned. When neighbors turn into rivals and rules become weapons, HOA Warzone brings you the real stories of property power plays and suburban showdowns. Subscribe now, and step into the battleground where every fence, lawn, and lake has a story to tell.